Welcome to our inaugural broadcast of Office Hours by Learning Communities. My name is Joe Perfetti. I will be one of our hosts. I am pleased today to be joined by my colleagues, Bob Parker, Scott Koerwer, and Lauren Hirshon. Just very quickly, if we do some introductions. Bob, you want to say something about yourself?
I've been in the management consulting business for almost 30 years. I run a signature program called the Pit Crew Challenge, which is on high-performing cultures and certainly focuses a lot on agility.
Great. We'll go counterclockwise. Lauren, why don't you go next?
Hi, thanks, Joe. Delighted to be here. I do work with high-performing teams, management, and leadership, both with a program at Harvard called Leadership for a Network World, where we get to work with chief transformation officers ranging from CFOs to supply chain leaders to chiefs of police. And I teach as well at Wharton.
Great. And Scott?
Yep, great. Hi, everybody. Scott Koerwer. I'm a partner with Joe at Learning Communities, professor at the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine, where I also serve as the Dean for Graduate Education. So thrilled to be having office hours with everyone today.
Yeah, and my name is Joe Perfetti. I teach equity analysis at the University of Maryland. I'm also an innovation fellow at Duke CE and do a lot of executive education, working with the Global 1000, including all the people on this call. The purpose of office hours is really a lot of us, including all four of the faculty on the screen, not only do executive education and do a lot of online work, but we find it to be a one-way communication in today's world. And we wanted to give you a chance to interact with us, ask your questions, get them answered, and provide some additional context in the application of some of the concepts. This show is going to focus on Agile Teams, and specifically how teams have gone from just teams to Agile Teams. So, Bob, why Agile Teams? What's different about that than our traditional team building stuff? Because I know in Pit Crew, you've been focused a lot on building teams, and I've personally been involved with that. But how are Agile Teams different?
Well, I think the difference with Agile Teams is the focus on what you're looking at. So you're not necessarily team-centered, you're customer-focused centered. And from that perspective, you're going to shift what your team's doing based upon the needs of your customer. So it just takes the line of sight differently than focusing inward. You're now focusing outward.
Yeah, and I'd like to provide some context, meaning that when we do a course with Duke for online on agility, and one of the things we found in our research is that, as Mike Canning used to say, 80% of the work that's done historically has been in silos at organizations. And going forward, 80% of the work is going to be done in teams because we now have to it's really the world of the customer, and decisions have to be made closer to the customer. So we have to empower the teams that do it. So I think that's actually one of the drivers of what we're calling Agile Teams. Lauren, I see you nodding your head. Are you seeing that in your work at Harvard?
Absolutely. So I certainly think that as we're facing greater complexity, and we need to come up with new, more innovative solutions, that we're going to be relying on high-performing teams, Agile teams, much more frequently to drive that. And in terms of definitions, I completely agree with what Bob just shared about thinking about customer-focused. And I like to draw on a definition that comes mostly from work by Richard Hackman, where he talks about high-performing or Agile teams as teams that are those that are able to, first of all, produce results. They deliver a knowledge, service, product that is meaningful to a client. I also think one of the important elements of high-performing teams is that they are growing and evolving over time. It's not just that team that wins one championship, it's the team that is able to repeatedly do that. And then the third element that I like to think of is it meaningful? Are people proud to say, I'm on team A, and I have gained from being a part of that team, and I'm learning personally and developing. So those are sort of three elements that I think of when I think of high-performing or Agile teams.
So Scott, I know that you run a lot of teams at the health system. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And, building upon Lauren's statement, I think I go back to Bruce Tuckman. In 1965, he had a great, but I would characterize linear methodology by how teams were brought together. They were formed, they stormed, they normed, and all of that was to prepare them to perform. And the way that we thought about it back then, and I invite Lauren and Bob into this. The way we thought it back then was, okay, we've got a task. We're going to pull together a team. Think of a SWAT team of sort. We're going to pull them together. They're going to bring this to life. They're going to win the game. Save the city, save the community, whatever. But the team is going to complete a task, and then they're done. What we like to think about, what I like to think about now is, so how do you enable these teams to continue, as Lauren said? So, these teams have to, continuously be engaged with each other. Technology, of course, brings that to life in many ways, but how do they socialize? How do you create the psychological safety for teams to positively agitate, so you don't have groupthink and they just take the shortest path to get something done, but then they're synergizing. So performing and socializing, agitating, synergizing, it's not linear, it's concurrent, and membership matters. So to Lauren's comment, absolutely have to have value in being a member. There's got to be this intellectual, emotional, psychological reward that goes with great performing teams. And, Bob, that's one of the takeaways that I have from watching your pit crew experience. You've just built that in. Folks don't win unless the team wins.
That's right. Yeah. And so knowing the end game is really important, knowing why you're there and what you're trying to accomplish, and that you've bought into it. So this drives right back for me to the foundation of everything. So what's interesting is happening next to the building that I live in is they're putting up a huge crane today, and I was fascinated to watch it because you've seen cranes go up from kind of far away. I don't know, many of us have actually seen one go up from the very foundation, from when they poured the concrete to put the actual crane on it. And I was fascinated with how much concrete actually goes into the foundation of just the crane, not just the building, but the crane, for that crane to be able to adjust and turn and adapt to what's around it. So for me, it comes back to knowing your purpose and your values, and driving everything from what's important and why you're doing it. And then that's going to drive into your culture and whether people are buying into things. So trying to get that alignment around culture. Those things are all exceptionally critical.
Yeah.
I also think there's a role of a leader. and so if I'm a leader, how do I interact with those teams? Do I do anything differently than I used to? Is it just command and control? Or what is my responsibility to manage these teams?
I'd like to jump in. Whenever I hear someone in an audience when I'm teaching says command and control, the hair on the back of my neck stands. Who's teaching that? And there are people teaching that. That's a way for people to get through some difficult stuff. And I'm not a command and control sort of guy. You shouldn't have to command and control. If you're, well, let me rephrase. Let me go this way. You're not an agile team if you're in command and control. That's what I'd like to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. Agility in teams means that folks become autonomous. They're decision-making teams. They're looking for opportunity. They're not. We always scapegoat Jack Welch when it comes to command and control. What was he called? Iron Jack or Hammer Jack or something. But the thing is, he enabled great teams to emerge among his leaders, and that command and control was confused in my mind with focus and purpose. What was he a firm leader? Probably, but my hair too goes back up on my neck, Bob. I think of the most effective teams are those who adapt and adjust. And I love to use sports metaphors, but if you're out on pardon the metaphor for anyone who is not National Football League based American, but when you're at the line of scrimmage and a play is about to run, and you call an audible and you change the play, you adjust based upon what you see. That's what Agile teams do. They call audibles, they adjust, and they're doing it together. There's not a command and control. It's a process. It's an engagement.
So go ahead, Lauren.
Can I jump in? Because
Yeah.
I'm excited about this. I agree completely with what Bob and Scott mentioned. And there's two things that I want to add. I just wanted to underline what Scott said earlier about the ability of Agile teams to agitate and socialize. And you mentioned psychological safety, and there's great research by Amy Edmondson that the most effective Agile teams are those that are comfortable sharing quirky ideas, making mistakes and learning from them, speaking up and disagreeing with the group. And I think there's a critical role that the leader plays in creating that atmosphere where it's safe and comfortable to do that. Things and strategies like allowing others to speak up first, being silent for a moment, the responses when mistakes are made. So I think that becomes even more critical as we're looking at the need for agility.
Yeah, absolutely. Mistakes with Agile teams, are positively cumulative. Now, you don't want to make the same mistake multiple times, but those mistakes eliminate bad pathways and can help guide a team towards success. So, it's part of a process. It's a good thing to learn, adapt, and move. So I'm glad you brought in Edmondson's work. She's a dynamo. It's and a real clear thinker about human interaction.
And by the way, when you say that as a finance person, I think about the word accountability, and I think what's behind that as well is trust. and my sense is that's also what's different about Agile teams. Meaning, as a leader, so this goes back to command and control. I have to trust that you are going to do what I need you to do in a similar way that's more consistent. And I think that's actually the biggest challenge as leaders have, is they fear that the teams are going to do something different, or they're not going to react fast enough to make the changes. And I think that's actually where two things start to matter to be what I'll call enabling conditions here. And this is actually work that comes from McChrystal in his work for Team of Teams. And I think this is what enables the Team of Teams to actually do it. And I think it's very, very important. Number one, he says context, which is if I'm going to have the teams do what I need them to do, I, as the leader, have to constantly provide them context. So that way they know how to make the same decision 90% of the time that I would, because that's the only way I'm willing to delegate. But the other key is transparency, meaning if I want Lauren, you to make the same decision I do, you have to see the same information that I do. And if you don't, how could I possibly expect you to make that decision? And I think that's something that organizations are also struggling with, which is they're willing to give context, but are they really willing to be transparent?
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends. It's a lot like finance, Joe. I'm glad that you didn't completely devolve the conversation into numbers and digits, but you bring a strategic framework to finance. How do financial models enable you to get things done? Well, yeah, that trust, that accountability, I think is a critical component of teams. And I can't think of teams outside of thinking about systems. Are there social systems, organizational systems, which are part of social systems? Are there mechanistic systems? What's the systemic frame that folks are working in? How do they interact? Are they willing to hurt a part to help the whole? Well, that's a big deal, and that's one of the components, from my view, of making a team agile.
Yeah. By the way, where does this fall down? Like, where are we seeing organizations struggle with teams in your experience, or where are they actually succeeding? What can we get practical about?
Yeah. So when you talked about the transparency, what was going through my mind immediately was around ambiguity. for sure. I mean, that's we talk about that a lot in Pit Crew, and with respect to context, right? Because when there's ambiguity, people fill in the blanks with the context they have, and if they're not looking at it with the right context, then they're filling in the wrong information, and then they go down perhaps the wrong path. And so I think one of the best things leaders can do is the attempt to remove ambiguity as much as they possibly can. And for that matter, even in our team meetings, is to challenge ambiguity. I don't know this. I need to know more. Or can we talk this through? Ambiguity is the Achilles heel of high-performing teams. There's no doubt about it in my mind.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the word that I think of when I hear you say ambiguity as well as clarity. I think if I could add to McChrystal's, I would say the third element beside context and transparency is clarity. And I was joking on a couple of webinars. I don't do classes anymore; they're all online. But long story short, we were on this call, and they were talking about SMEs, and half the people on the call thought they were talking about subject matter experts. The other half of the people on the call thought they were talking about small and medium enterprises, and it was like a comedy because I'm sitting here like they really don't know that they're talking about different things. When
Very different things. Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you said, Bob. Like people either fill in the blanks themselves, or the worst, they're afraid to ask, and then they're acting or refuse to act because there's ambiguity, and I think that's a barrier.
You know, every great team, in my view, starts with a definition of terms. You know, think about what would happen if we, if the four of us closed our eyes, you know, interacted with our colleagues, and started to define words that we throw around every day, you know, vision, strategy, purpose. We will not have the same definitions. The best Agile teams take time to form their definitions together. They're shared. You know, Bob, just to go off what you said, you know, I started to laugh. You know, of course, there's no ambiguity in the higher education industry. There's no ambiguity in the healthcare industry. You know, these are two of the largest, you know, sectors of commerce in the world. And of course, there's no ambiguity in these, right? You know, everything is transparent and clear. You know, what does this cost me, this procedure? Well, how would I know? Who would I ask? Where would I go to find out? It's not always written somewhere. It depends. It's negotiated. So, you know, definitions of terms, desperately seeking clarity. Yeah, I think we're all over it.
Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
Add to that, there are some dimensions that have been helpful for me, both in research with leaders and studying high-performing and Agile teams, but also coaching teams. And I like to go back to goals, roles, interactions, and processes and look for clarity in each of those. Is the leader set up a goal that is clear, compelling, challenging, consequential? With roles, do we understand our roles, how they interact, what our responsibilities are? Are we authorized to act in those? Have we identified gaps? We talked a bit about interactions, which I think of as the fluid, the oil that kind of keeps the teamwork going. How do we manage conflict? How do we create psychological safety? How are we building trust and doing that with intention? And then clarity around processes too, which you alluded to, Joe. What's our plan for defining terms, transparently sharing information, making decisions, workflow? Have we been intentional about that rather than defaulting to something we've done in the past, i.e. consensus-based decisions, when we really should be looking to an expert for that? So I think having those explicit conversations with teams around those dimensions has been helpful in bringing clarity.
So is this GRIP model, is this a leadership model? Is it a coaching model? Is it a team model? Like how, if I'm, you know, sitting out in the audience, how would I apply that?
Yeah, the way I've used it, I think it's both. I think what comes along with it is a set of leadership questions. If you're driving work within teams, it's been helpful for me in coaching teams. So I think you can use it at different vantage points. It came out of an article from the 1970s by an adjunct professor at MIT, and it's been used a lot in sports teams. But for me, what's fun and creative is using it both as an assessment tool to think about what are some opportunities for teams to enhance their effectiveness. And then I think there's a set of strategies you can put around each dimension. And you can be creative depending on the team that you're working with, because it looks different with each team, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead,
So
Bob.
I've got one other. This for me is the big one for me, the big downfall. So I've got my Agile Teams drivers that I shared. If you want to throw that up, because I've talked about most of these things are up here. Obviously, purpose and values, driving from customer focus. But the bottom right corner, metrics and rewards, for me is the biggest thing that just kills Agile Teams. And that is the question about what are we measuring? And at the end of the day, how do we reward those things that we measure? And when those things are not aligned to our purpose and our values, it creates structures in our organizations. It creates silos, for one. And those silos become very difficult for teams to be agile, because when you're talking cross-functional teams and having to rely on other teams within the organization, it's very difficult for you to get your job done when other teams aren't sharing stuff with you. But how you measure and how you reward is something that we've taken a lot of stuff from how other organizations have always done it. And we could go back to Jack Welch and how GE used to measure and obviously reward their people. Those things are antiquated, don't necessarily work, and they don't necessarily work in your organization. So they have to align to your purpose and values, and every single metric and every single reward has to align to that purpose and those values.
So I want to jump in here. So a few years ago, I was working with a cultural anthropologist named Maddie Boyer. She's now at KPMG. And she came out of Penn.
We love Maddie.
And we all love Maddie. So Maddie, if you're watching this, we all love you. But what's interesting is when she first started working with me, she's like, I'm a cultural anthropologist. And I was like, so you study dead people? And she's like, no, we don't study dead people. We study live people. And I was like, well, what live people do you study? It's like, well, we study culture. We study company culture. And I was like, really? You actually go to school for this? Like, yeah. And they're actually very much in demand. So by the way, if you're going for an education, getting a master's or a PhD, cultural anthropology, you're getting a job because companies trying to understand their culture bring these people in. And so I was like, kind of poking around. I was like, well, what's the secret to your success? Like, where do you start with the culture? And she said, we can actually start at one place that tells us more about your organization, anything all you do. It's your incentives. The incentives are the culture. And so I just want to pick up on what Bob said and completely agree with you, because you tell me your incentives, you tell me how people are going to behave.
I can tell you a lot too. Yeah. Sure.
because that's what we drive in our organization. And it's not just financial incentives, it's other incentives, because I want my team to take a risk, right? I'll give you a very simple game you can play to understand the risk of your organization. So I'll just do this with Scott, since he happens to be here on this video conference. So you ready?
Ready.
Okay. You can only play one game one time. I'm going to give you a choice of two games, but you can only play one of the games one time. Okay. At no risk to you. Okay. Hypothetical.
Yep.
I'm going to give you the option to flip a coin. If you call it correctly, you win $1 million. If you call it incorrectly, you win nothing. Okay. That's game number one.
Yep. Clear
on the rules? No risk to you.
Yes.
Game number two, we're going to flip a coin for $2 million. If you call it correctly, you win $2 million. If you call it incorrectly, you win nothing. If you could only play one game one time, which coin flip would you choose?
$2 million.
Bob, Lauren, did he choose correctly? Is that the right answer?
That's what I would have gone with.
Sure.
That is the right answer.
That's probably wrong.
But yes, if you could only flip a coin at a 50-50 coin flip, 50% at 2 million is better than 50% at 1 million, especially at no risk to you. You might as well take the higher flip. That is the correct answer.
Yeah.
Scott made the right choice. Okay. All right. Here's the important question. At Geisinger, somebody plays the wrong game. They chose the first coin flip for $1 million, but they won. And at Geisinger, you chose the second coin flip game, which is the right game, but you lost. What happens to those two people?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And, the unfortunate answer, while I can't speak for Geisinger as an enterprise as a whole.
So in a hypothetical healthcare system.
As a professor, at an institution of higher education, what I can say is, it depends. And, Geisinger is a great organization, but it depends. It depends on everything from, did you make that answer in, healthcare if you're saving someone's life, or are you making that in health insurance where you may be creating an opportunity for services? Or in higher education, where, as it may have been Kissinger or somebody said, there's so much argument and debate in higher education because there's really nothing at stake. So it depends what industry, it depends what context, it depends what leader. And, within a high performing organization, Agile Teams, I would still argue that it depends who you asked. So, if we were a high performing team and we had different answers, I immediately gravitated toward the 2 million because I'm feeling a little more risk taking today. So I expanded my latitude. Maybe Bob or Lauren would have said, well, no, I'm going to go after the $1 million. It's safer.
What's interesting is taking that, there's the same risk.
The risk the same. There's no difference. If it was 51%, 49, then it might be a little bit different. But
I think you're right about people's perception of risk.
Yeah.
Changes their behavior. And as I said, the perception of the reward changes their behavior, because this is what creates risk-averse organizations. Because I start pounding on accountable. Well, if I'm holding you accountable to a number and you're going to be taken out to the woodshed if you don't hit that number, well, guess what? You're not going to be willing to take any risks. And that's going to drive all the decisions in your culture, not just on compensation. I think, Lauren, you're nodding your head. Do you experience this in your coaching?
Is that me? Sorry.
Yeah, you're Lauren.
Yeah.
This is your coach.
About timely case study that we've been doing for our work at Leadership for a Networked World with Camden, and how they have reformed their police department, or made.
Is this Camden, New Jersey?
Yep, Camden, New Jersey. So there's one chief of police, Scott Thompson, who stepped into that role when the homicide rates in Camden were the equivalent to those in Honduras. Really challenging culture that needed to be transformed. And he was working to move from a culture of warriors to guardians. And one of the things that he did was change the incentive structures and what people were accountable for, and moved away from traditional performance metrics with city staff programs and police departments around arrests, more towards community engagement measures. And that was one tactical step that he took to change the culture of an organization. Great case. It's up on the Leadership for a Networked World website. My colleague Antonio Oftali took the lead on writing that and just did a podcast with Scott Thompson, if you're curious about it. But I think it was a nice, tangible example of a leader who was trying to transform a culture by changing incentives and rewards, among other things.
And again, I think in today's times, that's a very relevant comment. So thank you for sharing that one.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. That's a good story. It fits for me, and I think, Joe, when you're talking about the 2 million and nothing because you lost, same risk. I'm not trying to beat up on GE, but it's in my head now. The idea of forced ranking employees. I mean, that would be the exact same thing if at the end of the year you looked at your performance evaluations and Scott brought in nothing, but Joe brought in 2 million, same amount of risk across the board, and now I got to force rank you. Well, sorry, Scott, you're fighting for your job,
right?
Because you're now in the bottom 10%, and I may let you go. Not a great way to build a culture of people who want to take risks. And shall I say this at this point in time in the world, when this is being recorded, that if we don't come out of 2020 with people taking risks, we're going to be 10 years building this economy back. That's how long it took to even get to some semblance. And Joe, you can talk the finances, you know it well. But it took 10 years to get back to where we should have been. Way back when in 2008, 2010, because companies went risk averse and the employees went risk averse. No one wanted to lose their job. And we were not seeing agility. People were having to shift and pivot, but we weren't seeing agility because of risk and trust.
And by the way, I think there's a relationship, Bob, to what you're saying between risk and agility. Meaning the other element of Agile, which I think goes back to the teams, is being able to make decisions in an uncertain environment. I mean, I think a few years ago, the conversation started as VUCA. right? Now it just gets back to decisions under uncertainty. And we've been talking about frameworks such as Kinefin. I know Scott wants to expound on this in just a second, but the idea is that how do I make decisions with less than perfect information without being paralyzed? And how can I go forward not knowing what to do? But simultaneously, I'm going to make mistakes because I'm by definition don't know what's going to happen. Some of the times I'm going to get a bad outcome. Yeah. And am I overly penalizing my teams because they're trying to work in an uncertain way? Every time they make a bad decision, meaning bad outcome, I penalize them. And then I wonder if anybody's willing to go forward and take any risks. That's one of the challenges that we start to see permeate through our culture.
Yeah.
And
you nailed it. You nailed it. Then we don't touch those adjacencies, because we're so risk averse and we're operating in a state of fear. And to Lauren's point about that, the psychological safety goes away. We can't fall.
Yeah, and what we're seeing happen, and we're seeing in governments and a lot for leaders in organizations, they're just bailing. They're just saying, "That's it, I'm out." And particularly with respect to government, we're seeing people in high-level positions saying, "Look, you're just beating me up every way. I'd just do better if I wasn't here anymore." And then you lose people who have great experience and great things to contribute. I love that great example. I think it was the example was probably in Search for Excellence. Tom Peters, and it was probably about, I think it was Waterman, IBM, who had the VP who had lost $1 million. This was back when, in the 70s, maybe when $1 million was $1 million. And he brought the VP into his office and said, "Sit down." And the VP says, "Well, I know I lost $1 million. I suppose you're going to fire me." And Waterman said, "I'm not going to fire you. I just spent $1 million training you. You're not going to do that again, are you?" "Nope, not going to do that again. I learned." "Good. So get out there and try again." But you've been trained.
And I think those stories, Bob, are important things to tell. I mean, these stories make a difference to your culture. So I want to give, again, another practical example. And I've been fortunate to work with Google. And we did a bunch of training for the top 1,000 people in their ad business. And I was fortunate to go to a lot of different offices. Actually, I set a record at the time, back in the days we could travel, where I was on 4 continents in 1 week at 4 different offices doing training.
Wow.
And all I have to say is,
of Google.
Again. Yeah, that was just, somebody just said, "Well, we could schedule you that way." Doesn't mean physically I could actually keep up. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, at every one of their offices I went to, on every wall, there was a plaque that said, "Fail well." And I think that is actually a very important thing that they press on their organization, which is, we expect you to not always be successful, but when you fail, learn. And I think that's another aspect of Agile Teams. Agile Teams learn at an accelerated rate, more so than non-Agile teams, and put that into practice. And ironically, that's the whole point of how you make decisions, which is, if I'm waiting to act and Lauren goes ahead and act, even if she fails, she's going to learn something that I don't know, which is going to allow her to make a better decision and outlearn me and outdecide me over time. And that's the paradox, because waiting for information is actually a huge disadvantage and one of the challenges that teams have to get by.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you have to make bets, right? Joe, you love to use the poker examples. If you don't make bets, now these are bets that are educated. You learn over time. You learn about the competitor you're playing with. You learn about the game itself. You understand the odds better. All of this takes attention and practice, but you got to have, and we joke about positive agitation. You got to have that positive agitation ability to move forward. That really matters. And when you eliminate that from organizational life, as Bob casts that shadow of potential doom in front of us, it's very real right now. It's very real. Think about we had to make a decision in education about a graduate program, and the question was, Do we bring everybody back? Do we go online? Do we stay with the cycle that we're in now? Pardon me?
Fall, right?
Yeah, for this fall.
Yeah.
We don't have complete information, but the bottom line is I had to make a bet. So we did the best we could. We scanned the environment, we adjusted, and the team came up with the decision that we weren't going to wait till August. We were going to take everything online, but we were going to move up to July, and then we were going to go to quarterly intakes rather than a single intake. The clarity that we offered the marketplace enabled prospective candidates to make decisions faster, which gave them relief. Now, fortunately, we guessed right, but it was a bet, and that applies. That applies to poker. It applies to business. It applies to the manner in which teams operate and persist.
Yeah. The only thing I would just add to this part of the conversation is you also have to be able to act. And what I commend you is that you acted in the face of uncertainty, because I was working a couple of years ago with a company called United Health Group, which is one of the largest companies in the world. And one of the comments that their CEO, the previous CEO, was making to their leaders was that you're waiting to act. Like, go ahead and act with the information. Like, what are you waiting on?
Yeah.
And the short answer, to paraphrase, is people were waiting to be certain. And that was actually slowing them down. And so Jeff Bezos at Amazon, my understanding, has a rule that says act at 70%. And because you think, well, is 70% enough information to make a decision? No, but waiting for 90%, first of all, you're waiting for Godot. And secondly, how do you really know, even with 90%, that you're going to make that perfect decision? Go. Like, don't kill the company. So make smaller decisions and learn along the way. And that's a much better way to operate than just waiting forever to make a decision. Because going back to the poker analogy, sometimes you got to bet before you see the next card. And you can hem and haw all you want, but you still got to make that bet. And so many people get paralyzed, like, oh, I don't want to bet. Well, guess what? You're going to lose that game. And so that's what I think Agile teams have to be encouraged to do and prepared to do and get that psychological safety to do.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, so back to our conversation on teams. So Lauren, what are some of the other aspects of teams that you're personally seeing them struggle with, whether it's at Harvard or at Penn and Wharton in the classes you're teaching? What are some of the other things that are coming up constantly that the teams are telling you they're struggling with?
Yeah, one thing that I'm seeing right now, I've been working with a lot more virtual teams. And of course, how do you build trust virtually, and how to do that with a little bit more intention? So what are the strategies to get to know each other when you're not face to face, when you're not going out for drinks, and you don't want to set up a Zoom happy hour? And so that's been interesting to see how creative teams have been in addressing that, and how proactive, recognizing that as they're getting started, as they're starting a chartering process, they need to be intentional with what they're doing to get to know each other personally. And it fits with the research that we see from teams. Google found that their highest performing teams were those where, one, there was equal conversational turn taking. People were speaking up in roughly equal amounts. They were fully engaged. And that there was high EQ, high social sensitivity. They knew the other people on their team really well and could tell and interpret the reactions and had a sense of what they were facing in their day-to-day and adjusted for that so that they could maximize the potential of each team member. So I'm seeing that just play out in a different way virtually. I don't know if you all have experienced that lately.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things, this nominal group member approach, so teams share equally. And again, back to thinking in systems, teams that design together, teams that do things together, are more successful all the time. You want those teams. They don't have to be best friends, but they have to get along. They've got to have that time spent on relationship. They have to take time to practice. They can't just execute all the time. They've got to prepare. They've got to interact. They've got to find if you will, a rhythm together so that they can perform. So I absolutely agree with your point there, Lauren.
So Bob, just a question for you. I've seen your pit crew experience, and I don't know if the analogy applies to virtual, and you can help us. But in a matter of a couple of hours, you see teams that are performing poorly become much more synergized and get substantial jumps in the increased level of performance. What do you think causes that? What are you doing? What is helping that team formation to accelerate so quickly in such a short period of time? And by the way, my follow-up question to this is going to be, how can we learn from this in the online world that we're in?
Yeah. So what allows people to come together very quickly is clearly buy-in, right? Desire to want to do it. So clearly defined what are we moving toward, et cetera, and then there's that buy-in. One of the things that we do that we drive quite significantly is a coaching culture. And we force them to coach each other. They may not even want to, but we just keep saying, okay, coach, now coach, now coach. And they're looking at each other, oh, well, I guess I got to say something to you. I'd rather you force something in an uncomfortable scenario because it's a start, right? And everyone's uncomfortable because they really don't know what they're doing. They're changing tires on a race car. And what's amazing about this experience and this metaphor is that people have probably not changed tires on a race car before, at least under a clock while someone's standing behind you with a whole team of other people doing it. You may have changed a tire on the side of the road, not really going to help you much in this scenario. So everyone starts at a very even plane. In other words, one person doesn't have any more experience than anyone else. So it really does allow for that coaching piece to come in very easily and for people to actually do it. So once the coaching is happening and people realize that it's encouraged that we coach, I've got something that I want to say, so everyone's open to it, then we can move them through once we start looking at the metrics and the rewards and clearly defining what's driving their behavior. People want to win, and they want to win something, whether it's at the end of the day pure on bragging rights or more compensation or promotion or whatever it is. People are looking to better themselves or better positions for that matter in their life and their world. So clearly defining it is really, really critical.
And I appreciate your comment about coaching. And again, since Lauren's probably our most professional of the coaches on the call today, like how do we coach in the virtual environment so quickly? What are some of the things that you would say as a coach that we could learn from?
Yeah. Did you see my face light up when you said that, Bob?
I was watching myself on video, making sure I was animated.
Yeah.
I didn't. I'll watch the video later.
Yeah. I think some of it, with these, that we can teach these skills in different ways and help people to grow their teammates and create different opportunities. So it becomes part of our regular cadence with teams, that it's known. I'm going to give feedback at this time. I'm going to ask for feedback. I'm going to encourage you to practice it. I think you can give people a set of questions to look for that helps to grow the teammates as leaders that are transferable for whatever work they're doing. And I get excited about developing that and testing that. And I'm currently working with some teams out in Colorado, some action coaching teams that are in the process of developing some solutions from what they see on the front lines working with job seekers. They're going to propose to state policy leaders and encouraging them right now to coach each other on what are the strengths that you observed and what are the opportunities. If this person is to accelerate and start leading their organization tomorrow, what would you need them to see them do as a leader to be more effective? And I go back to the GRIP framework. What does that mean for how they set goals? Are they clear, compelling, challenging? Do they help to align teams around that? What did they do within their role and helping to identify gaps within roles, helping to authorize others to act? How are they building trust? How are their behaviors translating into managing conflict more effectively? And then what can they contribute around processes? Do they slow down decision-making processes when we need to be agile and quick? How do they introduce and share information? So I think there's a set of questions that you can ask related to some of the foundations of high-performing teams, and I've had fun with that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, Joe. Yeah. So, Lauren, I love the sense-making device that you bring into play. And, back to Bob, having observed you a number of times with the group, what I like about what you do in the debriefs is your candor. You're not a blunt instrument, and Joe and I enjoy the blunt instrument metaphor from time to time in organizational life. But your candid approach, the clarity in the feedback that you give, I think makes all the difference. And we bounced around with Welch a little bit, but that was one of his things. And in fact, that's where Joe and I drew inspiration for the whole positive agitation thing, is, that candor. And this is just a fun thing to break the ice, to get the conversation going about candor. But, every washing machine, has an agitator. That's the device you're looking at. And, positive agitation is good. It's not a bad thing. But that courage and the psychological safety for candor, Bob, that's one of my best takeaways from your debriefs with teams as you're helping them get better. You're very candid, very clear. That makes all the difference in an Agile team.
No, thanks, Scott. I appreciate you saying that. I'm glad you shared that, because it helps give me some clarity as to why people do like the program, aside from the fact that it's fairly effective. But I try to be straight up with people. I'm not. And I think that's what we need to do as leaders, is say, hey, here's where we are. What can we do to move forward? And we're all here working on it together. So I'm not attacking individuals. I'll challenge thoughts and things of that nature. But it's hey, here's the scenario, and it's not where we want to be. So, team, what are we going to do? And that's just as much a coaching piece as anything. It gives people the opportunity to share their ideas together. And one of the challenges we have with coaching is, whether we're doing it publicly or privately. And online is our big problem. Is now I've got my entire team on a screen, and am I giving coaching when everyone else is around? And I think where in the workplace, you might be giving coaching to someone, there might be someone within earshot or some of that nature. And those sorts of conversations really do get people to, oh, yeah, that's something I should make a mental note of myself. And I think we lose it if we take the risk of going to one-on-one with our coaching. If it's a hard conversation or a difficult conversation, that's a different sort of coaching conversation. I'm probably going to suggest that's going to be done face-to-face or one-on-one. But when it comes to, what can we do differently? This is what I saw, those sorts of open-ended coaching questions. Does anybody have any ideas of things they saw that we could do differently across the board? Those open conversations, I think, are going to be really important. Yeah.
And Lauren, I know you are very thoughtful with your language, the way you craft the questions. How might we? A little humility, even a little humor when appropriate. And again, Welch would say, followed up by a handwritten note, which, with the championship, I feel like I'm channeling my grandmother now, for goodness sake, as many handwritten notes as I had to write, especially when I did something wrong. But, I'm interested in how you create and phrase, some of the language with teams makes all the difference for, someone staying engaged.
Thank you, Scott. That means a lot. Actually, one of the things that I look for, I've had the pleasure of working with a ton of fantastic leaders, and I always listen for the way they ask questions and find that they tend to ask more questions than offer suggestions. And I completely agree with you that there's a lot of power in the language. And as you said, I think sometimes the phrasing can invite people in a different ways. If you're focused on opportunity, and you want to blend what Bob was mentioning, that clear is kind. And there's some great inserts and some research and strategies for asking questions in a really powerful way that comes out of Brene Brown's work, who talks about clear being kind. So how can you get it succinct and create a space that's open for someone to step in and join you in the conversation?
This is Joe. I think this is what you had in mind, with office hours. How do we have a conversation around, great topics, complex issues? Do we leave behind, for those we're engaged with, things to think about, things to read. I wish we had a video clip of Bob's teams working, because it would not only amplify the point, but would highlight some of those. When the tire rolls by, or when you lose a nut, and or when you spill gas on your buddy.
We don't have gas, Scott. We don't
That's right. Sorry.
No liability issues there.
Try this at
No
home.
liability, no risk that way. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, I appreciate that. And I think that, one of the other things we're trying to do is try to be practical. And I appreciate the very practical examples. So I think we're coming to the end of our time for our first show. And what I'd like to do is, as professors, we often give people some things to take away to think about before they come to their next class. And so what practical things would we give to people to think about? And I will start just to set this. We're going to go around. But the first thing is, coming out of the session, if I'm thinking about, giving guidance and coaching, I like that word, there's going to be three things that are going to matter. So I'll go back to what I mentioned with McChrystal, which is we have to increasingly be people that focus on providing context. We have to be much more transparent with giving them the data along with that context. And we have to basically excel at clarity, be as plain spoken as possible, and eliminate ambiguity. As I listen to our conversation today, that seems critical if I'm going to be an enabler of an Agile team. So that's the first takeaway that I would give, and I would challenge everybody listening to this to begin with. Do you want to go next?
I'll go next. Mine is going to be take a look at your performance metrics and how you're rewarding them. Just open that up. Say, what is everything that I'm measuring everybody, and what am I feeding back to the people? What you measure and what you feed back might be two different things, but it's more about what the person knows about themselves. That's really important. But look at your metrics, look at your rewards, and see if those are aligned to where you're going. And if you're having a problem with something, getting someone engaged, it's probably going to lie in those performance metrics and rewards somehow.
No, I think words of wisdom, Bob. Thank you.
Yeah.
Who's next? Lauren?
Sure. I might suggest trying to put the framework of growth into play. What are the questions you ask yourself about how your team is operating related to goals, roles, interactions, and processes? And as Scott was saying, to really take the time to think about how you're framing and phrasing those questions, so you can find one or two opportunities to be a bit more effective, a bit more efficient, more likely to get better results. And if you have fantastic questions, share them with me too. I put out that call to action.
Yeah,
absolutely. And Scott?
Yeah. So two takeaways for me. I'm a big fan of the Kinefin framework as a sense-making device. So, taking Lauren's lead on the grip frame for sense-making, and then also weaving in the Kinefin framework by David Snowden. We can, link that to this, post-session. The reading assignment, if I was able to give one, would be the Harvard Business Review article by Paul Levy called "When Good Teams Go Wrong." It's a great story about a group of people very committed to health, safety, and who ended up inadvertently participating in a massive mishandling of waste and pollution. So when good teams go wrong, Paul Levy, great reading to highlight what works and doesn't work in teams.
Now, thanks for that, Scott. And thanks for everybody being here today. The other thing that I'd like to focus on is what we're all about. Like, part of office hours is part of building a learning community. And we would strongly encourage you to continue the conversation with us and participate in our learning community. Basically, our URL is www.learningcommunities.com. We are starting to assemble content on agility, on leadership, teams, culture, finance, etc. And we look at this as a living, breathing community of experts, of users, of practitioners, and we're starting to aggregate content. If you have some content that you think is relevant and useful, feel free to submit it to us. Otherwise, we wanted to make it a resource for people that are trying to apply this material as well. And a lot of what we're seeing on the show is there, and we look at it to be a living, breathing, dynamic format. So feel free to check us out at learningcommunities.com. But we unfortunately need to come to the end of our office hours, and we're going to have to give everybody some time back. So with that in mind, again, Bob, Scott, Lauren, thanks for joining us today on our inaugural show, and look forward to hopefully seeing you participate in the future. And for those of you that saw us live, thanks for joining us live. For those of you who didn't, please join us live during the next conversation, because we would like to see some of your questions that we can answer and participate in these conversations. So other than that,
Dynamite.
thank you for your time today. The professors have to go to class. We are ending our show. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.